Last time, we ended in the fog of hardship, with breadlines, jobless streets, and a nation learning to lean on itself again. The Great Depression had scarred America, but the country was still standing. There was hope, jazz, swing, and cinema, small joys, stitched into every thread of recovery. But while America tried to find its rhythm again, the world outside was beginning to hum a darker tune. Far across the Atlantic and Pacific, leaders were rising, not with healing words, but with clenched fists and military marches. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, ambition turned into aggression. Empires were being imagined, borders were being crossed, and ideas, poisonous ideas, were turning into policies. The world was about to go into a war again. This is where learning history becomes so important. It is not just about the past, but it is about the mistakes we as a species has done in the past and learn from those mistakes so that we do not repeat it. But we are human beings. We repeat it again, again, and again. Welcome to US History Understanding This Country. I am your host Santosh Janardhanan and you are listening to the Irregular Mind podcast. If you have been enjoying this journey, please follow, rate, or share this podcast. It helps a ton. I am doing this solo out of pure love for history and storytelling. Let's keep this going together. Alright, let's step into the world on the brink. The 1930s are ending and storm clouds are gathering. For now, we are going far away from the US and look farther across the pond and in Pacific. The First World War may have ended in 1918, but it didn't really end, not in any lasting or a healing way. Think of it less like a final curtain and more like a bandage slapped onto a deep wound, and the wound kept festering. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to prevent another war, but instead of building peace, it planted resentment, especially in Germany. That treaty was brutal. It blamed Germany entirely for the war, stripped it of territories, limited its military, and the real kicker, demanded crushing reparations. That's like telling someone to rebuild their house while taking their tools, kicking them out of their neighborhood, and handing them a bill they could never afford. Germany's economy tanked, inflation went wild. In 1923, you could walk into a bakery with a wheelbarrow full of paper money and still not have enough of a loaf of bread. People lost faith in democracy, in Weimar government, in the future. And that despair wasn't just in Germany. Across Europe, many felt disillusioned. They had survived the war to end all wars. But what came after? Poverty, instability, fear of communism after Russian Revolution, and in looming sense that the world had simply lost its moral compass. Meanwhile, over in the United States, the 1920s rolled, but isolationism took hold. America didn't even join the League of Nations, the very organization President Wilson had envisioned to preserve global peace. It was like organizing a club to prevent neighborhood fights and then refusing to show up. So, by the early 1930s, what you had was a shaky world order. Fragile economies, rising nationalism, weak democracies, and whole lot of unresolved bitterness. In that chaos, strong men found an opening. The wounded piece was bleeding out, and someone was about to take advantage of the mess. By the early 1930s, Germany wasn't just unstable, it was a country on the edge, desperate for anyone who promised order and dignity. That someone arrived with fiery speeches, precise salutes, and a talent for weaponizing pain: Adolf Hitler. Hitler didn't appear out of nowhere. He rose through the disillusionment left by Versailles and the economic wreckage of the Great Depression. The German people had tasted democracy, the Weimar Republic, but it felt weak and chaotic. Inflation had turned savings into dust, and employment lines stretched for miles. That made Hitler's message that Germany had been betrayed, that it had to rise again, sound less like hate and more like hope to struggling population. Once the Nazi Party gained traction, everything escalated fast. Hitler became the chancellor in 1933. Then, after the Reichstag fire, he exploited fear to consolidate power. Civil liberties gone, opposition crushed. Germany wasn't a republic anymore. It was a one man rule wrapped in a swastika. At the heart of Hitler's ideology was a twisted racial myth, the belief in an Aryan master race. According to Nazi doctrine, Germany's greatness had been lost because of Jews, communists, and anyone deemed impure. That anti Semitism wasn't just in the air, it became law. Jewish businesses were boycotted, books were burned, and people were taught from childhood to obey and hate in equal measures. This was more than just dictatorship, it was totalitarianism in its rawest form, where the state controlled the media, the schools, even the thoughts in your head. A Nazi salute wasn't just symbolic, it was mandatory. Germany, once a democracy with poets and philosophers, was now marching in goose steps to the drumbeat of fascism, and the rest of the world was still watching. While Germany was still reeling from its post war punishments, over in Italy, a different flavor of authoritarianism had already taken root. One built not just on rage, but on nostalgia. Benito Mussolini, with his slick hair, black shirt, and the booming oratory, didn't rise on the ashes of defeat like Hitler. Instead, he rose on the memory of glory. Italy had technically been on the winning side of the World War I, but it didn't feel like victory. The spoils were thin, the economy was fragile, and political gridlock made parliament look like a circus. Enter Mussolini, a former school teacher and a socialist turned ultra nationalist who knew how to spin frustration into frenzy. In 1922, he marched on Rome, not with tanks, but with pageantry and intimidation. King Victor Emmanuel III, hoping to avoid civil war, handed him the power. That was the last democratic whimper Italy would make for a while. Mussolini didn't waste time. He clamped down on dissent, outlawed opposition parties, and used propaganda like a conductor using a baton, orchestrating public emotions with slogans, rallies, and a myth of national destiny. The trains ran on time, yes, but so did the censorship and arrests. Fascism, as Mussolini framed it, wasn't just a political ideology yet. It was a total lifestyle. Loyalty to the state come above all, above church, family, or self. Individualism was weakness, democracy was chaos, and freedom, that was a relic of liberalism which fascism claimed to fix. But Mussolini had bigger ambitions than controlling Italy. He dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire, not with togas and olive wreaths, but with conquest. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations left. Italy used chemical weapons and overwhelming force there. The League of Nations issued condemnation, but no real consequences. That silence from Britain, from France, from the US, it was deafening. It told Mussolini and dictators like him that expansion might be tolerated if it came wrapped in enough swagger. And Italy was no longer just the land of opera and espresso. It had joined the rising choir of authoritarianism, and Mussolini was only just getting warmed up. While Europe bristled with its fascists and fanatics, the Pacific had its own imperial ambitions. The Japan was leading the charge. But this was in the Japan of cherry blossoms and silent temples. This was a militarized machine, gripped by a belief in its divine right to rule Asia. The roots of Japan's aggression go back decades, but things accelerated in 1930s. Japan was an island nation with few natural resources but with grand ambitions. Its leaders, especially those in military, believed Japan had to expand to survive. They preached the idea of Hako Ichiyu, the divine mission to bring Asia under one roof, Japan's roof. So they turned their sights westward, towards China. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and rest of the world looked the other way. By 1937, full-scale war erupted between the two nations. What followed was one of the most brutal chapters in modern warfare. The city of Nanking, then China's capital, fell to Japanese army in December 1937. What happened next shook even the world already used to bloodshed. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers unleashed terror on the city. Civilians were murdered by tens of thousands. Women, children, and even elderly were not spared. The world would later call it the rape of Nanking. And estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to 300,000. It was mass murder, mass rape, and mass trauma. It was evil made systematic. Western missionaries and businessmen in the city tried to create safety zones. Some succeeded in saving lives, but many could only bear witness. Photographs and survivor accounts eventually made their way into West, sparking outrage, but little action. Japan, like Germany and Italy, had gambled that world's democracy were too timid or too tired to intervene, and so far they were winning the bet. But these weren't isolated outbursts. These were part of a pattern. Nations testing the boundaries, pushing beyond borders, and discovering that nobody was pushing back. It is just like a high school bully picking on a weak kid until a bigger bully pays him back. After World War I, Europe was like a wounded animal, exhausted, anxious, and desperate to avoid another bloodbath. So, when Germany started acting up, annexing Austria in 1938 and then eyeing on Sudeten land in Czechoslovakia, most Western leaders weren't thinking about confrontation. They were thinking about buying time. That's where Neville Chamberlain comes in, the British Prime Minister who famously waved a piece of paper and declared peace for our time. This was right after meeting Hitler in Munich. The deal: Hitler could have the Sudetenland as long as he promised not to take anything else. Chamberlain called it appeasement. In hindsight, it was a gamble that cost dearly. And of course, Hitler broke that promise just months later, taking the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. But by then, he had already secured a shocking new alliance that stunned the world: the Nazi Soviet Pact. Yes, Hitler and Stalin, two of the most ideologically opposed dictators, signed a non aggression pact in August 1939. But there was a sinister little secret attached, a clause that allowed them to carve up Poland between them. It wasn't peace, it was a deal with the devil on both sides. By now, the world has started to connect the dots. Germany, Italy, and Japan weren't just acting alone, they were acting in sync. It was a well choreographed act. The Rome Berlin Tokyo axis was officially born, uniting fascist powers with a shared interest: expansion, dominance, and destruction of democratic ideals. And then came the real horror. The moment Hitler decided to go all in. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. But this wasn't some slow, trench based grind like in the World War I. This was something altogether new and terrifying. It was called blitzkrieg. That is a German word for lightning war. Here is how it worked: tanks, trucks, and infantry moved fast and hit hard, coordinated with Luftwaffe air raids that softened up targets before ground troops were arriving. Communications were centralized, radio guided, and fast. No more waiting of horses or messengers. It was modern, mobile, and merciless. Poland was crushed in weeks. France fell in 6. This wasn't just military strength, it was a psychological shock and awe. Civilians were terrified. Enemy armies were caught off guard. Nothing like this was ever seen before. And while Hitler marched west, Mussolini attacked Ethiopia and then joined the fray in Europe. Meanwhile, Japan expanded further into Asia. The Axis powers weren't just regional bullies, they were global predators. But just when it seemed like nothing could stop Axis, the winds shifted slightly over the English Channel. In 1940, after France had fallen and Nazis occupied Western Europe, Hitler set its sight on Britain. His plan, Operation Sea Lion, was to bomb the country into submission and then invade. Thus began the Battle of Britain, an air war like no other. London and other cities were pounded by bombs night after night. Sirens wailed, families took cover in underground shelters, and entire neighborhoods went up in flames. But somehow, Britain didn't break. Thanks to radar technology, brave RAF pilots, and the stiff resolve of civilians, the Nazis suffered their first real setback. Winston Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister, summed it up in a line for the ages.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
It was not a total victory, but it proved that the Axis could be stopped and maybe, just maybe, turned back. The world was burning, but across the Atlantic, America still clung to neutrality. In the aftermath of World War I, America didn't come out swinging like a hero. It came out burned. Over 100,000 dead, massive war debts, and public that felt dragged into foreign mess for unclear reasons. The 1920s and 30s saw the US drift into a deeply isolationist mindset. The idea was simple: stay out of European problems. This wasn't just a public mood, it became law. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts that banned the sale of weapons to countries at war, restricted US ships from entering combat zones, and generally kept America on its own little island. Across the country, groups like America First Committee gained traction. They argued that US soldiers shouldn't die for Europeans' mistakes again. Some voices were purely patriotic. Others, like aviator Charles Lindbergh, drifted dangerously close to supporting fascist sympathies under the guise of peace. But not everyone was comfortable with staying out. As reports of Hitler's atrocities, Mussolini's aggression, and Japan's expansion hit the headlines, the moral tension grew. Was it really right to ignore tyranny just because it wasn't on our doorstep? That quiet national unease started to stir. And at the center of this balancing act was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Publicly, he maintained a posture of neutrality, but behind the scenes, FDR was preparing America for the possibility that neutrality might not be an option for long. In 1939, Roosevelt pushed through a tweak in the neutrality laws known as cash and carry. This allowed allied nations like Britain and France to buy weapons from US as long as they paid cash and handled transportation themselves. It kept America officially neutral while still helping friends. But the real pivot came in 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act. This was Roosevelt's masterstroke. It let the US lend or lease military equipments to any nation deemed vital to America's defense. It wasn't just charity, it was strategic. Roosevelt called the US the arsenal of democracy. Factories started humming again. Ships, planes, tanks, they rolled off American production lines in staggering numbers bound for Britain and other embattled allies. America was still technically out of the war, but it wasn't neutral anymore. The gears of industry were turning. The arsenal was arming, and the line between isolation and involvement was getting thinner by the day. While the US debated from the sidelines, the storm was already at its doorstep in the Pacific. Japan, driven by a fierce hunger for raw materials and regional dominance, had long set its eye on Asia. Its invasion of Manchuria in 1931, full-scale war with China in 1937, and the unspeakable brutalities of Nanking all signaled an empire on the move. But by the early 1940s, Tokyo was aiming higher: control of the Pacific. The US, while officially neutral, had started to resist Japan's expansion. Washington froze Japanese assets, imposed oil embargoes, and tightened the screws diplomatically. Japan saw these as threat to its survival and began planning a response that would catch the world's most powerful country off guard. Then came December 7th, 1941, the fateful Sunday morning that shattered the illusion of safety. Just before 8 am, waves of Japanese aircraft descended upon the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In under 2 hours, battleships were burning, aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans lay dead. The USS Arizona was obliterated, entombing over 1,000 sailors inside. It wasn't just a military strike, it was a psychological gut punch to an entire nation. The very next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and uttered the words seared into American memory, a date which will live in infamy. The Congress responded with a near unanimous vote to declare war on Japan. The speech went like this:
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the US a few days later. Just like that, the isolationism was dead. The debates were over. America had officially entered World War II and it wasn't easing in slowly. It was all in on both the European and Pacific fronts. The sleeping giant had awoken and the world would never be the same. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Americans didn't just mourn. They rolled up their sleeves. The country launched into one of the fastest and most intense mobilization in the modern history. Within weeks, the US economy flipped from peacetime to total war production. President Roosevelt created the War Production Board, WPB, to steer the economy. Its job is to just get the tanks, planes, bullets, and the boots flowing and fast. Car factories in Detroit that once made shiny sedans were now rolling out B 24 bombers. Typewriter manufacturers pivoted to rifles. Nylon, once used for stockings, was now a parachute material. Ordinary Americans joined the effort too. Rationing became fact of life. Gasoline, meat, sugar, rubber, all limited so that the military could have what it needed. Victory gardens sprouted in cities' backyards. Kids collected scrap materials. Families proudly bought war bonds, not just to invest but as patriotic duty. This wasn't just industry, it was everyday life retooled for war. As millions of men shipped off to war, it left behind a massive labor gap. Who filled it? Of course, women. For the first time in the US history, women joined the military in significant numbers, though not in combat. The Women's Army Corps, women appointed for Volunteer Emergency Service, that is WAVES, and Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. They paved the way. These weren't just ceremonial roles. WASPs flew test flights and ferried aircraft across the country. WAVES worked in intelligence and communications. WICs were medics, mechanics, and clerks. And in factories, women became icons, literally. Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled, and eyes fierce became the face of wartime production. It was more than just propaganda. Real women were working long hours building planes, ships, and ammunitions. It was liberating. Many women tasted financial independence and purpose outside traditional domestic roles for the first time. The war may have opened doors for some, but for others, the home front was riddled with discrimination. African Americans, for example, faced a cruel paradox, asked to fight for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. They launched the WWII campaign, Victory Against Fascism Overseas and Victory Against Racism at Home. Activists like A. Philip Randolph pushed for change, and Roosevelt, under pressure, issued Executive Order 8802, banning racial discrimination in defense industries. Still, the prejudice ran deep. Black workers were often given worse jobs, lowest pay, and faced daily racism on job and in the streets. As bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, another kind of bomb was quietly dropped at home, this one on civil liberties. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were US citizens. They were labeled enemy aliens not because of evidence or action, but simply because of their ancestry. This decision wasn't based on any military intelligence. There was no proven sabotage, no conspiracy. What fueled it was fear, wartime paranoia, and deep state racism, particularly on the West Coast, where anti Asian sentiment had simmered for decades. Families were given just days to pack what they could carry. Homes were boarded up, businesses, farms, and personal belongings were sold off at rock bottom prices or left behind. Entire communities, many of them thriving just days earlier, were uprooted and herded into relocation centers. Let's be honest, no soft words. These were just prison camps. Guarded by barbed wire and soldiers with guns, the camps were remote, dusty, and harsh. Life inside was humiliating. Families were crammed into drafty barracks with no privacy. Communal toilets, showers, and mess halls replaced normalcy. Schooling was minimal, jobs were menial, and the loss of dignity immeasurable. One legal challenge reached the Supreme Court. In Korematsu vs. United States 1944, the court upheld the government's actions, claiming national security justified the exclusion orders. It would take over 40 years before the US government formally apologized and offered reparations through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. But by then, generations had already lived with scars. The internment of Japanese Americans stands today as a powerful reminder. Even in democracies, fear can silence justice. And while this chapter was marked by shame, what came next would shake the entire world. In the next episode, we will follow the American military across the Atlantic and Pacific as the Great War Round 2 goes full throttle. And that brings us to the edge of the battlefield. What began as a distant rumbling in the Europe and Asia had now pulled the United States into the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. At home, Americans were working double shifts, rationing sugar, rubber, planting victory gardens, and listening to war reports on the radio. The country had transformed almost overnight, industrially, socially, and emotionally. But the full brunt of the war, that was still to come. In our next episode, we will follow the US troops across the ocean to the North Africa, to Italy, and on to the blood soaked beaches of Normandy. We will meet the generals, the soldiers, and the silent heroes back home who kept the war machines running. The arsenal of democracy was about to go global. If you have enjoyed this journey so far, you want to keep this podcast going strong, I'd be grateful if you could follow, rate, or share it with someone who might like it too. Every little bit of gesture helps me keep telling these stories with care and clarity. Until next time, this is Irregular Mind signing off. Stay curious.